Yeah,
Go
it's
ahead.
started. So in this course, we mainly solve quantum algorithms and how to solve problems using quantum algorithms. But there's another field in mainly in classical computing called information theory, where which basically deals with like the transfer of information, which is basically like transferring a string of some bits from one person to another, and also considering the losses and the compressions that are possible. So, giving a quantum perspective to this is basically quantum information theory, where bits are represented as qubits, and this is what I'll be focusing on today for the first part of this talk. So, in this talk, I'll cover some basics of quantum information theory and a famous theorem which we'll come across, and then moving on to classical computing and local decoding, which is a part of error correcting codes. We saw quantum error correcting codes in last week, so kind of related to that, and then random access code, which probably like I'll introduce in the end. So, so first let me start by we know that a state in in quantum computing, the states are usually represented as like a superposition of these basis states, and like these are usually like we create these states in some pure form, but it might sometimes happen that these states might get corrupt. Like suppose that there is some extra heat in some part of the quantum system and this alpha 1 changes and something happens. So it will usually be some mixed state, which I'll define, and that basically is that the this gives the concept of quantum noise. So basically, if some of these changes, then it will give us some mixture of these states psi 1, psi 2, psi d, which like when we measure the system correspond acts like the state psi 1 with probability p1, psi 2 with probability p2, and so on. So it is like none of the states is equal to psi, but it acts as a mixture of this after some noise is introduced. So mixed state is basically a state represented by PIs. There should be a comma here. Probabilities along with some states, and the matrix for the mixed state is given by a density matrix, which is basically represented by this. And you can see that like this is how things are defined when you measure according to a given an orthogonal basis v0 to vn. When you measure with respect to this basis, you will observe this basis vi with probability exactly equal to this. This is quite equivalent to what we saw where the probability used to be like there used to be only psi bra ket psi bra only here, but now it's changed to summation of pi's of like the weighted mean of all the states represented by this. So also like on a pure state, if you act some unitary transformation, it would have been u into psi. But in our case, in mixed states, the density matrix, this thing, will change according to this rule for a given unitary. This
Sahib,
can be, yeah,
just give me a second. Can you go back to previous slide?
yeah,
Yeah. Just to put this in context, we have discussed it multiple times in the course that quantum superposition is not same as probabilities or a probabilistic mixture of states. We have seen Deutsch's algorithm, things where quantum algorithm or superposition does much better than a probabilistic. This has to be clear to you that quantum computing is not same as having probabilistic computing. This state alpha 0 0 plus alpha 1 1 plus alpha n is not same as a state which is 0 with probability alpha 0 square, 1 with probability alpha 1 square, and so on. That's only a consequence. Now, suppose someone says, okay, you have superposition, but you want to integrate probability in the same mathematical formulation, right? We know how to represent basis states. We know how to talk about superpositions. But what if we have probabilistic computation over these superpositions? In other words, as Sayak has very nicely described, what if we want to represent a state which is in state psi1? Notice psi1 is not a basis state. It could in itself be a superposition, right?
Yes.
Psi1 with probability P1, Psi2 with probability P2, Psi d with probability P2. If this is the quantum state, we need a mathematical framework to capture the state of the system. The reason why we need another system is because now we have probabilities over the states which are in superposition. Psi1 is a state which will have superposition over basis state 0, 1 up to n. For this, Sayak has introduced this thing called density matrix. This is a very, very nice framework. You can, whatever 3, 4 postulates we saw for the states, we can make all similar parallel postulates for density matrices. And it is completely independent in the sense that, remember the first postulate? Can someone remind me what is the first postulate? Anyone?
States exist in Hilbert space?
Right. They were a unit vector, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Instead of saying that they are unit vectors, now I can say that they are going to be density vectors. And then my entire quantum mechanical framework will go on. What Sayak is describing in the next 2-3 points is, if I talk about these states as my first postulate, what will be your second postulate? What will be your third postulate? And so and the reason why we are interested in this new mathematical framework is because we wanted probabilities over states which are in superposition. Sorry, sir. Please.
Yeah. Thank you for the adding to this. So yeah, that's precisely it. And basically this was motivated because even in classical information theory, things are not like things might get corrupt very easily and noises are like introduced very often. So the same framework is coming to quantum mechanics as well. So yeah, you can do these constructions, and there is some properties of mixed states which I will not focus on because of less time. So you can verify these properties, and like mixed states are not unique because like given a density matrix, it can correspond to different mixed states with different probabilities and the pure states. Now next
Sorry,
we know,
just
yeah,
to clarify the previous point, what does he mean? Mixed states might not always be distinguishable.
I mean
There
that
can
the
be,
density, yeah,
right, there
yes
could be
sir.
P1 psi 1, P2 psi 2, which has the same density matrix as I have states Q1 phi 1 and Q2 phi 2, right? Both can have the same density matrix. It could happen.
Yeah. So that basically means that this sum is not unique.
Sir, so in like previously we had unit vectors in Hilbert space. So now for these these kinds of states, we are having these density matrices, right?
The state of the system will be described by a matrix which is positive semi-definite and whose trace is 1.
Okay, okay, sir.
Unit vector will be replaced by these two conditions.
Okay, sir.
So yeah, we know POVM measurements, and we did not see uses of POVM measurements in the course, but here you will see some of this nice properties. So there's a question of encoding bits into smaller bits. Like suppose you have a given string which consists of one first bit is one and then followed by 100 zeros. So you don't necessarily need to write all the 100 zeros individually, but you can just say that the string is just one followed by write a code for printing 100 zeros. So this is called a compressible bit, where number of bits required to actually represent this bigger bit is smaller than its actual value. But there does exist some bits which are incompressible. That is like you cannot represent them as smaller bits. So this is a thing of classical information theory, and does the same thing hold in quantum computing as well. So in order to state that, we will first define some preliminaries from
Sorry, Sec, again, I think I would emphasize this. How many bits does a qubit represent? This is something, again, in the, what should I say, simplified version or popular science version of quantum computing. People would say, oh, to represent a qubit, the amplitudes are complex numbers. They encode lot of information. Hence, we can do lot of stuff with that. This is a wrong idea, and this is what you will see. The title of the slide is Holloway's bound. You will probably, Sayak will talk about it. It will basically say that one qubit can at most encode one bit of information. Now, these things have to be defined, and they are defined formally in information theory. But intuitively, even though to represent a qubit, we might need many bits, right? We want to write two amplitudes. Each amplitude is in a complex number. It is very, very difficult to write a qubit. Still, it cannot encode more than one bit information.
Yeah, so that indeed is a surprising fact, and like the theorem is also a very popular one and has a lot of consequences which we will see in the end of this talk. So for that, let me first state some preliminaries. This is called the Shannon's entropy, and I am just considering discrete, discrete. These random variables are discrete random variables, not continuous. So for discrete random variables, Shannon's entropy is defined as this. Similarly, you can define for the random variable x comma y, as it will just be p of x comma y log p of x comma y, followed by mutual information defined as this. Then you can see through these examples better. So the main thing is that accessible information. It is basically if you encode encode some bits into a quantum state, which is represented by a density matrix given as this, then the amount of information you can get out of that quantum state is defined as I accept of rho comma p, which is defined as this. That is, you take like you consider sets of POVM measurements, and uh, the maximum information you can take over all the POVM measurements that are possible is basically given by this. So this we will show that this has an upper bound. Like we will, yeah, so there's another thing, von Neumann entropy, defined as given by S equal to this thing where rho is the density matrix, and this can be written as like rho is a matrix, and you can perform the singular value decomposition to get eigenvectors and eigenvalues. So from the eigenvalues you can show that this thing is precisely equal to this. So moving on. Okay. So the protocol is as follows, that Alice has some bits of information, and these bits of information are represented as a random variable x, taking values between from 1 to n with probabilities of each being this. And then Alice creates a quantum state, and like this mixed quantum state, and sends this to Bob over a channel. Now Bob does not know anything about X, but comes up with some POVM measurements of his own and tries to measure this density matrix, and he hopes to get as much information about X as possible over like by varying his POVM measurements. So the maximum amount of information by definition is given by this. So Oliver in 1973, which was like almost during the time quantum computing was starting, they proved this thing that like if Alice uses this protocol to send to Bob, then the maximum information Bob can get given by this is upper bounded by the von Neumann entropy, and the expression is precisely this, which was proved by them. So later, Cleve, Cleve and others gave
Sorry,
this.
what was chi?
Chi is chi is just defined as Holov's information. It is the maximum information possible
Oh,
that you can get.
so you have defined chi in the above equation.
Yeah, chi is named after Holovo.
I
This expression basically.
okay. Okay.
So, so based on this, Cleve et al. Proved in '98 that this thing holds, which basically says that if Alice sends m qubits to Bob, then Bob cannot, and they do not have any prior entanglement, then Bob can get at most n bits of information about X. This is pretty surprising, as Sir just talked about the amplitudes requiring many bits of information to store those complex numbers, but still you cannot do any better than you could do in classical state. So this is when they do not have an entangled state. However, if they have an entangled state between them, which is usually the Bell state which you saw in quantum teleportation, a similar method, quite like the inverse of quantum teleportation, exists, that is called superdense coding, where you can show that if Alice sends m qubits to Bob, Bob can get at most 2m bits of information. However, notice that this is not that great, because if you are sending m qubits of information, it's just a constant factor of m. So from this we get that even if you send information using qubits, you cannot do much better than what you did in the classical case. So, and in classical case, of course, this is true.
So one question.
Yeah.
So over here you mentioned that if Alice sends m qubits to Bob, then Bob receives at most 2m bits of information.
So, supposing that they have some prior entanglement.
Okay.
So yeah, this is basically superdense encoding. I don't think I'll have time for that, but if I have time, I can talk about this. The figure is basically like this. They have this entangled state prepared.
Sir, don't
Yeah.
you will not be able to cover it. Just say it is
Okay.
kind of, you remember quantum teleportation? Quantum teleportation, we transported one quantum bit using two classical bits. It's
Yes.
exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
You will now transmit one quantum bit and get the information about two classical bits. And
Yeah.
you can read about it. It's called superdense.
Okay.
That's
Another nice fact I wanted to add is that when you share a quantum entangled state, you cannot get the values of each of the qubits individually. So that is a nice thing that this protocol exploits.
Sir, how are we going to transfer the quantum bit?
see again, being a computer scientist, I would say I don't worry about the details of implementation. The point in quantum teleportation was the setting where we did not have quantum communication channel. In this setting, the motivation could be that you have a quantum channel. Do you get a factor or do you get an improvement? Can you send only one qubit and get more information than just sending a classical? And the advantage you can get is just basically a factor. That's what
Okay.
Hollywood found.
We are assuming that we have a quantum channel to
Yeah.
transfer qubits,
Yes.
right? Okay.
So by transferring less number of qubits, we can send more information. Is that it?
No, but we need entanglement, right?
Okay.
Otherwise, without entanglement, not more than if m qubits, then we will not have more information than m bits.
Okay.
Yeah. And even in this case, it's not that great. It's just twice. Yeah. So moving on. This was basically an introduction to quantum information theory, and quite a surprising result this is. So I hope you find it fascinating. And then moving on, like Holovos theorem was proved for quantum like communication like that. Now we are moving slowly to classical communication, where so I'll also prove this Holovos theorem, that a special case of this Holovos theorem now, which basically states that you suppose you have a random variable x, which is uniformly random over the numbers 1 to n, and then using x, you encode that that bit x in that string x into some mixed state rho x given as this, which has a d-dimensional density matrix, basically like d states with probabilities, and you then measure this mixed state in POVM operators E1 to En. Now, the probability of obtaining the correct value of x is given by the trace of this, which was shown before, and this can be shown that this trace is less than equal to trace of Ex. Now, probability of completely decoding this string x, which contains log n values, is precisely like you sum over all the px's and upper bound it with success probabilities, which is basically from this we get this. And since the POVM measurements have the property that the sum of all these POVM operators is identity, you get trace of identity, which is D. So you correctly obtain the string x with probability less than D. Now, if you encode n bits of n uniformly random bits into m qubits like this, then the probability will basically be D. In this case, it was D by capital N, which now is equal to 2 to the power m by 2 to the power n, which basically states that if the difference between m and n is something of a polynomial, then the probability will be quite less, which is basically why you can't do really good. This just was a special case of Oliver's theorem. Now, moving on to quantum random access codes. So basically, you have a string x1 to xn chosen at random, and you encode this as before into a density matrix given by rho x. Now you want to, like we saw that we cannot decode the entire string, but what about the fact that if you want to decode some individual bits of this? So random access code, basically when you give an input I, it will give you the ith bit of x with a good probability, which is some factor above half. This is same as saying that given I, you can find a measurement mi comma I minus mi such that this thing holds. For xi equal to 1, this probability should be higher, and for 0, this basically means that if the measurement is obtained at mi, it gives the value of xi as 1, and if it is obtained here, then it gives the value of xi as 0. So when the actual value of xi is 1, it will be true with probability greater than equal to half, greater than equal to p, which is half plus epsilon. And when it is 0, then it will give an error with probability less than this, which is less than half. So this is what we want to achieve using quantum random access codes. Now the question arises, like notice that this does not violate the Holovos theorem. This is basically because like once you measure, the quantum state collapses. You can't work on that properly anymore. Like once you measure the value of x1, it might not always be possible for you to get the value of xn after that. So this does not violate Holovos theorem, where you get the entire string, the entire information from this at one go. So this does not violate Holovos theorem, and we can possibly think of trying to use less number of bits to represent this, so that we can have random access to any bit of the string. So it has been shown that if if you have two classical bits, then you can encode it into one qubit, and the encoding where this half plus epsilon probability will be exactly equal to 0.85. This can be done and has been achieved in these two papers. While you can also encode three classical bits into one qubit for random access codes done in this paper.
So what you are saying is that you will have x1, x2, x3 encoding into one qubit, but at a time you can only get one
Yeah.
bit, either x1 or x2
Yeah.
or x3.
This is precisely why, yeah,
Correct.
exactly. This is why it does not violate the Holovers theorem. Yeah.
Right.
So, any questions on that? Okay, I'll move forward. So, it was also shown that you cannot encode 4 bits into one qubit with probability half, which is greater than with probability p, which is greater than half. This was shown, and then more general results include that how much shorter can you go, like given m qubits, n classical bits, which is greater than 4, how many quantum qubits do you need to encode this into a mixed state such that you can have random access to any bit? Now we know that this cannot be done for one qubit, but maybe we can go higher. Now we want to study how much difference between the number of classical bits and number of quantum bits required are. And then Ambranis and others proved that this bound holds. Suppose you have m bits, classical bits, and you encode it into n qubits, then m will always be a function of this, and this is not a tight bound. So later Nayak proved that, no, actually it was almost in the same year, Nayak proved that this thing holds. M is greater than equal to 1 minus, this is the entropy which we define. So it's almost linear. So in this case as well, you cannot do much better. So any questions on this? Okay, I guess not. So moving on. We saw error correcting codes in last week, classical error correcting codes, where like a code is in a coding scheme, you usually encode some bits into another scheme of bits where like you want to achieve the condition of information lossless scheme. So this basically says that when you have one bit and you encode it to another bit, then there must not exist any third bit that gets encoded to the same bit. So basically in error correction, we saw that some bits might get corrupt with some probability. Suppose that instead of writing probability, I say that some bits might exactly at most p number of bits might get corrupt when you store a string of length n. Then like we basically define this Hamming distance as this, where the matrix means that in this figure, it basically means that you have x, and when you have another string which differs from x at exactly one bit, this will be at distance, this will be at a sphere which is covering x and of radius 1. If they are at a Hamming distance of 5 bits, then the sphere will be of radius 2. And for information lossless condition where the bits do not overlap, you need these two spheres to be disjoint, as otherwise they will have some intersection and it will not be information lossless. So
Another way to think about it is that you are sending code words, right?
yeah,
Now, X can be, if there are T errors possible, then X could become any one of those code words which are in the circle around X. Similarly, if you send Y, then it after noise, it can become any of the code words which are in this sphere, which you are calling territory of Y, right?
yeah,
And then if they intersect, then there is something which, so let's say Alice sends some code word and the what Bob gets is something which is in both spheres, then Bob has no idea that it came from X or it came from Y, right?
Yeah,
So that's why we want them to be disjoint.
yeah, precisely. So we'll see an encoding scheme where this does not happen. Like it usually happens for Reed-Solomon, Reed-Mueller codes where there is some intersection, but we will see a coding scheme soon. But first, let us define, like we saw in random access codes, similarly there is local decoding where you have a encoding scheme given by this, and this is called Q delta epsilon LDC. If when suppose you want to find the ith bit of the initial string, then you take Q queries of this into the encoding, Q random access queries, which is available by an oracle method, and using all those values, you can actually actually decode the value of xi with some high probability. So this is basically it. I'm sorry if I'm going a bit fast, but time is almost up. So Walsh-Hadamard code is defined as this, and in this you can prove quite like you proved in midterm exam, the last question, that this actually achieves the distance of half in this previous figure, in this figure. So there was an example, and here's another example of two queries. Like it is said that Walsh-Hadamard can be decoded in exactly two queries. This is how we do it. You suppose you want to decode the value of this, you take some random z, which is random index z of the encoded string, and some index z or I, and you find these two values. Then you can see that if you take the XOR of these two values and using the property of the encoding scheme, you can precisely get the value of xi. And both of them returns correct value with probability less than 2 delta, which means that it, it returns the total uncorrupt bit as with probability 1 minus 2 delta. So Walsh-Hadamard is 2 delta and half minus 2 delta LDC. Next
Sorry,
theorem.
Udit has asked a question in the chat. Udit,
Okay, I didn't
please
know.
wait for. Yeah, he sent it to me personally. Udit, wait after the presentations, you can ask it to Sai. Okay, yeah, finish. Sai, you have only 2 minutes.
Okay, so this is a theorem by Travis and Katz, which says that given an LDC, there exists some set of indices given by this bound such that this probability holds. Like just this theorem, I won't prove this theorem, but we'll use this. So notice that in the in this figure, if we want to increase this d minimum, we need to have many number of encodings, which is why if you are given n bits, the number of encoded bits might blow up, and we will show that for being able to decode correctly with two queries, the number of bits will actually be exponential in the initial number of classical bits. So we will use quantum computing to show this. So basically you have this encoding, and the strategy is to encode this into a mixed state of m qubits, like log m qubits, sorry, like this. The basis states are from 1 to n, and we know how to construct this oracle from the classical counterpart. Notice this -1 to the power 2. So the number of qubits in this is precisely log m, and Oliver's theorem says that log m must be greater than or equal to, and in the least case equal to 1 minus h, this entropy of p into n, which is some constant into n, which basically implies that, sorry, this must be log m, the number of qubits. So log m is some constant into n, which means that m is some power of 2. So this basically says that for 2 queries, you need to encode this into an exponential number of bits. Now, is this proof complete? This is not, because you need to show that this actually is an LDC. That is, you can take 2 queries to this oracle, and with 2 query access, you can exactly find the ith value of x. So how can we do this? We do this in series of 2 measurements. First, suppose you want to decode I, then you take this mi, which is given by Katz-Trevisan theorem, and for each tuple in jk in mi, you construct this projector matrix, and you measure with respect to this matrix created like this, like matrices created like this for each tuple, and there is a remaining matrix T rest given as this, so that the sum equal to identity. And if you measure and get the value with respect to any of these projectors, then the probability will be 2 by m for each, and for all of them it will be this. Or otherwise, if you get the measurement in this, you just randomly choose one bit and output your value. So for this you can calculate the probability, which will come later. But notice that after the measurement, if it comes in the right case, that is into these projectors, the values will be like this. The final quantum state will be like this. And then if you measure with respect to these two orthogonal states, you will exactly get the value of this. And using Katz-Trevisan theorem, you can also add this bit to the XOR of this to exactly find xi with some probability, which was described there. And using those calculations, you can show that this also holds, and this basically means that this quantum encoding is also a valid LDC. So it is basically surprising, because we proved that for 2 query LDC, and LDC is a classical protocol, and when we are taking a 2 query LDC, this n bit string gets mapped to at least a exponential in n bit long string, which is given as the output with random access. So this is a completely classical phenomena, but it's proved like this using quantum computing. So I'm sorry if I rushed this a bit, but yeah, thank you. And like, if you found this talk interesting, I would recommend you to look at this course, which really had a lot of things regarding this. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Saif. Can you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah. Okay, I think it hanged.
Thanks, Saif. Viprit, could you share your presentation?
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your presentation. Yeah. Next, Deepajit will talk about continued fractions. Remember, we talked about Shor's algorithm, and once in the end of the Shor's algorithm, we need a continued fractions algorithm to actually get the factors out. Deepajit will present that and something more. So, Deepajit, over to you.
Yes, so this talk does not directly focuses on quantum computing, but I think everyone who is at least interested in any form of computation, this tool called continued fractions will come useful. So everyone should listen to this thing, because uh, whatever it might be, let it be classical computation, let it be quantum computation, we often it is needed to use a lot of tools. So continued fraction has a lot of applications. Uh, because of less time, I couldn't prepare. I couldn't prepare, means I couldn't include a lot more details into it. I wanted to, but because of less time, I couldn't do it. So we'll just discuss only one application, and also there exist several other more applications, which I will just refer to you. Okay, so firstly, we have to answer that what is continued fractions. So continued fraction is basically, you can think about it as a way of representing a number. Like we know, we are familiar with the notion of decimal representation of real numbers, and also there exist other form of representations like binary representation and hexadecimal representation, and there are a lot more. So a continued fraction is a kind of representation of like this. So it has some advantages that we will discuss over decimal representation. Yes, so continued from basically what we want to do, that given a number, a real number to us, we want to express it in this form, where a0, a1, a2, all these things are belongs to integers. A0 can be negative, positive, or 0, but a1 to a2 we make sure that these things are all belonging in natural numbers, which means positive integers. Okay, so our next question can be how to represent this in any real numbers in this form. So we first begin with rational numbers. So how to represent rational numbers in this form? So we what we can do is, suppose the number that is given to us is q0 by q1. So q0 by q1, I mean, this thing belongs to z, and because this is rational. So as z is an Euclidean domain, we can express it in the division algorithm. There is something called division algorithm,
Uh,
and we can.
Deepajit, let's not, we don't need that. Let's just say that Z, people know about integers, right?
Okay. Yes.
Just focus on integers.
Mhm.
You don't need to go into generality of a Euclidean domain.
Okay. So we can express by division algorithm. We can express uniquely q0 and q1 by q0, q1 times a0 plus q2. Q2 is the remainder, and a0 is the quotient. So what we can do is we can
Yeah.
divide both sides by
Just,
q.
just for everyone, this is something which you are taught in class third class or fourth standard or something in school, right?
Yes.
Nothing more difficult than that.
So basically what we are doing is we are dividing both sides by q1, and we are obtaining a representation like a0 plus 1 by q1 by q2. And we are taking reciprocating this last factor, so that now we know that from division q2 will be less than q1, so q1 by q2 is again greater than 1, and we can repeat this process recursively to obtain the entire representation. Now our question is, why does it terminate, and how is it giving the representation that we want? So this is exactly same as Euclid's GCD that we learned in our school. So just recalling GCD. So suppose we start with q0 and q1. So q0 and q1 we can represent it like this, and then again we will take q1 and divide it by q2 and proceed, and after that it will stop whenever we get a GCD. So this is where it ends. So how can we modify it to make it a continued fractions? We can just divide both sides by this factor, by this qy. Qy you can divide it both sides, and we obtain this representation. Now what we are doing is we are just replacing these things in one after the other. Means like q0 plus by q1 equals to a0 plus 1 by q1 by q2. So in place of q1 by q2, we will replace a1 plus 1 by q2 by q3, and so on. And after that, we get our representation as a continued fraction expansion. Okay, so the time from as you can already see that this is entirely same as GCD. So the time for computing this representation is also same as GCD. We can do it in polynomial time. one advantage of this representation is there are some rational numbers which which are non-terminating when we describe it in decimal representation. Those things we call as recurring decimals, like for example 1/3. But in this representation, every rational number always has a finite representation. So our next question can be how to represent irrationals as a continuous fraction. So before going into that, we'll go through some notations. So the continued fraction a0 terminating at an is described as this thing, where this semicolon separates the first term, which can be positive, negative, or zero, and all these terms are strictly positive. So as we shall see that irrational number will also has representation of a continued fraction representation, but that will never terminate. That will go on. So we can do the so we represent it this thing as like this, means this thing we call as convergent. We stop at a point an and take the representation up to that. So a0 to an, these things are called convergent. Then as this thing we can think of as a sequence of number which are converging to the number we want to represent, the irrational number x that we want to represent. So that is why we give this notation. So now let's move on to infinite continuous fraction. So if x is the irrational number, what we can do is in order to compute it, we can first check what is the float of that value, separate that integer out, so that we can write x as a0 plus 1 by x naught, where x naught is 1 by x minus x. So as you can see that x minus float of x is the fractional part of x. So this is 0. So this is lying between 0 and 1, and when we reciprocate it, it is becoming greater than 1 again. Yes. Okay. So this x naught value will be always again greater than 1, and we can repeat our steps recursively again and again to expand it into a continued fraction. So basically we cannot track this with using computation because this process never stops. But this is, as you can easily check, that this is just an extension of Euclid's GCD algorithm. We can say that taking an analog that this GCD never stops. This will continue from indefinitely. So there are a lot more representation of continued fractions, like the continued fraction. This representation, infinite continued fractions, can be periodic also. So the periodic continued fractions are generally represented as in this form, 1 by beta, where we stop at beta because this is periodic. After that, it will continue again. So we can just simplify this expression and check that it will give us a quadratic expression in beta, quadratic equation in beta, whose root we can obtain, and that root will be an irrational number. And as it is a quadratic equation, the form that beta will satisfy will be as a plus square root of b, this kind of form.
Sorry, what are A and B? You will find out by solving the equation, or
Yes, by solving the equation, we get a. I have just represented this quantity as surds that we get actually. A
this is
plus
the
root
form.
B. Mhm.
It will be of this form.
Yes, this will be of that form. Okay. So any more questions up to this point? Okay. So the why this representation is unique. So we can ask this question, that why we can uniquely represent any real numbers like this way. So the representation is exactly not unique. We can represent it in two different forms, like rational number. Suppose a rational number is represented as expanded as a0 to an. So what we can do is we can extend this thing by an minus 1 and 1. What we are doing is so yes, so over here we are stopping at 1 by an. So we are not doing that. We are taking an minus 1 plus 1 by 1. So we can extend that and make the last an plus 1 equals to 1. So these two are the basic representation of uh, any continued fraction, and these are the only representations. So why is it so? That is because that again comes from as Z is an Euclidean domain, and Euclidean GCD is is giving us a unique result. It cannot have many results because we are just following division algorithms. So for infinite continued fraction, we get a simple inductive explanation of this thing, why this has the unique representation. So let x can be represented as a0 a1 continue and b0 b1 continue, these two forms. Then we claim that ai will be all equals to bi for all I greater than equals to 0. So recall that the algorithm that we are obtaining for the expansion of irrational numbers was we were separating the floor of that number and taking that floor out, and then again then adjusting our terms. So we can represent this as x equals to a0 plus 1 by a1 continue and b0 plus 1 by b1 continue. So as we claim that all these things has to be greater than 0. So we can easily check that the floor of this function has to be floor of this quantity x has to be a0 and also has to be b0. As floor is uniquely determined, we can say that a0 is equals to b0.
I
Now
guess,
in the
Dikshit, I think this is kind of clear. So,
Hmm.
can we move on to like how do we solve the problem which we needed to solve in the Shor's
Yes.
algorithm?
Okay. Yeah.
That,
Yeah.
that is
This is a
very
very simple proof. So next comes our short algorithm continuation. So let me state it once more again. So that algorithm, the theorem was h by r minus phi. If h by r minus phi is modulus is less than 1 by 2 r square, then h by r is a convergent of phi, and we can get it by suppose if phi is given to us, we can compute the continued fraction representation of phi, and in polynomial time we will terminate and we will be obtaining h by r. This is the thing that we will discuss, and this proof is also non-trivial that we will discuss.
sorry, Dikshit, yeah, just probably give more context. Remember when we do the Shor's algorithm,
Hmm.
we get a number phi,
Hmm.
right? And the point was that we want to come up with the closest, in some sense, rational number,
Hmm.
right? Because our answer was actually R. This was the order
Hmm.
which we wanted to capture. And what we noticed was that we could get any S by R where S is some number,
Hmm.
correct? Uh, what now, the theorem which was very helpful to us was that if we are given an irrational number, which is very, very close to S by R, then we can recover S and R. Obviously, it assumes that S and R in the lowest form. S and R do not have any common factor. But the point was that this theorem tells us that if you have an irrational number which is very, very close to S by R, then we can recover S and R. And what is that closeness? That is this 1 by 2R square.
Hmm.
And can anyone tell me why is this 1 by 2R square thing important? What does it tell us? This 1 by 2R square thing. What does it determine in Shor's algorithm? Do you remember? Okay, so this slightly kind of deep, but if you remember Shor's algorithm, we kind of put it as a phase estimation thing, right? And in phase estimation, we need to know how, with what precision we want to find our phase. And here, this is exactly what we are doing. It tells us that so 1 by 2r square will be bounded by 1 by 2n square. Then it tells us that if we can compute phase with the precision of 1 by 2n square, then we will be able to recover r.
Yes.
And computing the phase with the precision of 1 by 2n square, that actually only takes polynomially many applications of it. That is why Shor's algorithm in some sense is polynomial time. This is coming up in the time complexity of Shor's algorithm. It was a phase estimation for the for us to be able to calculate S and S by R, phi should be really close to S by R. That means it tells us that we want phase with a lot of precision. How much precision? 1 by 2r square, which is obviously bigger than 1 by 2n square. That's why we will run our phase estimation so that our phase is very, very close to S by R. It is close by a distance of 1 by 2x. And then the algorithm or the theorem which it is going to show will make us get S by R from phi. If you don't remember the context, important thing is you have a rational number which is very close to a rational number. How can we get the rational? That's what.
Yes. In order to proceed with the proof, we need to discuss something more on convergence. So remember about the convergence that we discussed in the previous slide. Those things were inside square bracket that A0 to means the thing of this kind means the more and more closer to closer approximation of a particular number. So so basically what we are doing is we are taking so over here we assume that A0 from starting from A0 to all the numbers that we are the sequence of numbers that we are taking over here, all the numbers are positive real numbers, and we generalize this notion to real numbers. We are not assuming this to be integers anymore. In this proof we will just take this as real numbers and prove a result. So we take some initial conditions like p of -1 equals to 1, p0 equals to a0, q0 equals to 1, and q of -1 equals to 0. Then what we are going to show is that a0, a1 to ak, this convergent is exactly equals to pk by qk, where we define pk by qk recursively as ak pk minus 1 plus pk minus 2, qk is ak qk minus 1 plus qk minus 2. This holds for all k greater than equals to 1. So this is one of the theorem that we are going to prove. And over here a0, a1 to ak is our usual this notation. Again, to make things clear, this is not as these all are real numbers. We are not considering anything about continued fractions right now. Just we are mapping this representation into this representation. That is what we are doing. The next theorem that we are going to prove is if ai are all integers, then so is pk by qk. In that case, we can say that qk pk minus 1 minus pk qk minus 1 is -1 over k for all k greater than equals to 0. And pk by qk equals to 1 for all k greater than equals to 0 when ai are all integers. Yes, so I have included the proof sketch over here.
Sorry, can we
Yes.
go back? Like,
Mm.
seems what you're saying is pretty strong.
Yes.
What are you saying? PK by QK. What do you mean by bracket PK by QK?
Which one?
The second last point.
Second. Oh, this one. Okay. Oh, sorry. Oh, this will be a comma. I made a mistake. Yeah, this is just that pk and qk are co-prime.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
This will be a
that's why
comma.
it seemed-
This
that's
is
why
not
it seemed
a
very
fraction.
strong.
Yes. This will. I'll correct. So let's begin with the first proof. So this is a simple inductive proof that we will do. So we first check that. So what is our inductive base case? Our inductive base case is k equals to 1. K equals to 1 means a0, a1 we will consider. So a0 and a0 comma a1 is expanding it by a0 1 plus a1. So we can make this simplification and check that then the base case is satisfying. Just plug in the values over here, and you will be seeing that this is the thing. So this thing is true for the base case. And inductively, we assume that A0, A1 to AK is Pk by Qk, where Pk is this thing and Qk is this thing. Now we take A0 to A1 to AK plus 1. Now we are modifying this thing a little bit so that the length becomes equals to K. What we are doing is we are combining it with the last term, and we are obtaining a K length sequence. And as we have already inductively assumed it for K length sequence, we can apply directly over here and let it let this thing be equals to Pk dash by Qk dash. So what we so applying the inductive hypothesis, we get that Pk dash by Qk dash equals to AK plus 1 by AK times Pk minus 1 and plus Pk minus 2 divided by this thing means this is the last term. This last term multiplied by Qk minus 1 plus Qk minus 2. So this we are obtaining from the inductive hypothesis. Now, as we are taking a new thing this time, means A0 A1 to AK, then A0 A1 to AK minus 1, then AK plus 1 by AK plus 1. This was significantly different from what we had previously, A0 A1 to AK. So we're taking the convergence as P dash Q dash over here. So notice that P dash K minus 1 equals to Pk minus 1, and P dash K minus 2 equals to Pk minus 2. Similarly, for these things, it will hold. So we can just replace this thing in the equation, and we will get, after simplification, we will get P dash K by Q dash K equals to Pk plus 1 by Qk plus 1, which we wanted. So this completes the first proof. The second proof was about that. So let me go back to it once. So second proof was this thing: Qk Pk minus 1 minus Pk Qk minus 1 is minus 1 whole power K, where K is greater than equals to 0. So this we are also going to prove inductively. So first assuming in the base case K equals to 0, we have Q0 P minus 1 minus P0 Q minus 1 equals to 1. This we also can verify. So we assume it for the K step inductively, and we get Qk plus 1 Qk Pk plus 1. We just replace Qk plus 1 and Pk plus 1 by the notation that we obtained last time. What we are doing is we are dividing it by Qk and Qk plus 1, and we are simultaneously multiplying it by this thing. And after simplification, we get Pk by Qk, and then over here we will get Pk plus 1 by Qk plus 1, which we have replaced it by the formula we obtained the last time. And after a few step of simplification also, we can see that it gives us minus 1 whole to the K plus 1. So this proof also is done by simply by inductively itself. So so the third argument actually is simple. As soon as we prove this is because so let me go back. Yes, so this will be comma. So what we are going to prove is that Pk and Qk, we want to show that Pk and Qk are GCD1. So from this expression, it is that we have proved, it is directly clear. If it is 1, then obviously by Bezo's notation, we can see that Pk and Qk is 1, and if minus 1, then we can multiply it by minus 1, and the same thing happens. So I have just given another approach to prove this thing. There is also a simple linear algebra proof of this thing above. What you do is the recursive expressions that I have given over here, you can formulate this in terms of matrix, and then you have to take product of a lot of matrices. Then you have to apply a determinant, and that will give you directly what you want. So the determinant will be Pk Qk minus 1 minus Qk minus 1 Pk. That will be minus 1 whole to the power K. So that is a direct proof. So now we will move to our main proof that we wanted to, that is S by R minus 5 is less than 1 by 2 R square, then S by R is a convergent of 5. So just for simplicity of notation, I have replaced S and R as P and Q and phi as X, because I am using these things over here as PQ, so it was simpler for me. So the new theorem is P by Q minus X modulus is less than 1 by 2Q square. That is what we want to prove. As this thing is happening, so we can easily write it as X equals to P by Q plus delta by 2Q square, where delta modulus is less than 1. Means this expression I am modifying it like this. We can always do that because X minus PQ is always less than 1 by 2Q square. We are multiplying it by just a number, and we are modifying things a little bit.
So now here P and Q are integers, delta can be a real number, right?
Yes. So here we can take P by Q as A0, A1 to AN. What we are trying to show is that PQ, that the continued fraction of X that X will extend then the continued fraction of expansion of PQ. So we assume that P by Q has this form, and so the nth convergent Pn by Qn gives us PQ. So we
This is what we want to prove, that there is some n small enough such that Pn by Qn is equal to P by Q, where Pn by Qn are coming from the continued fraction expansion of X.
Yes. No, we assume that the notation of means P by Q has Pn by Qn. This thing we we assume, and we are going to show that in the continued fraction of X just extends this thing. It just extends the continued fraction representation of P by Q. That is what we want to show, because the main theorem is that whenever this thing satisfies, the continued fraction of X will contain P by Q, P by Q as a convergent. So
we would also need to show that n is small,
right? Why n has to be small?
Because what will be your algorithm to find P by Q? You will start writing the continued fraction expansion of X.
Yes.
Correct. And you will check first expansion. Is it close to X by distance 1 by 2Q square? If yes, I will output that. If not, go to the second P by Q, right? And so on.
Yes.
So, and anytime, if the expansion of X is B0, comma B1, B2, B3, so on, I will try first B0, then B0, comma B1, then B0, comma B1, comma B2. At any point, if I get a rational number which is close to X with a distance less than 1 by 2Q square,
I'll stop. Yes.
And what you have shown is that at some point I will get a number like that. Correct. But then this algorithm should be efficient, right?
Yes.
If n is too big, then I will have to try too many expansions before I get P by Q.
But in the actual algorithm that we were doing in Shor's algorithm, means over there we were approximating it within 1 by 2 n square, right? So we will just continue, means that n is coming from the input itself, right? So we'll just continue with this algorithm as soon as until and unless we get P by Q close enough. So,
but the n there is not the same as n here, right?
No.
What we want to show is that, yeah, so the n we started with, we want to show that the number of steps after which the P by Q will be, how should I say it? It will terminate. The number of steps should be small in terms of this, whatever is our input size in Shor's algorithm.
Okay.
Right? Otherwise, we will take a lot of time to find this P by Q.
No, suppose if we assume that this n is big, then the bound that we are taking over there, one less than 1 by 2n square, our algorithm was depending on that, right? Means we are just taking closeness with respect to that n, that in that input n that we are taking. So it does not depend on the n, that the expansion of PQ that we get over here.
No. But okay, so what is your strategy? What is your algorithm? Suppose I give you this theorem that for some, let's not call it n, for some convergent after 1 million steps, that convergent is equal to p by q. Or
Yes.
Let's call x is first convergent, second convergent, third convergent. X is capital Nth convergent is p by q. And capital N is very, very large. How will you obtain p by q from x? You have only x at your disposal, right? You have this theorem that after some millions of times or some capital N times, this convergent will be equal.
Yes.
Then what will be your algorithm to find p by p and q? So that is
So
why
basically, the thing that I remembered is over there we were considering s by r minus 5 was less than 1 by 2r square. So r was less than n, right? So now you're saying that if the representation of s by r means p by q, this ends becomes large enough, but that doesn't that gives us a contradiction? Means how can this n be larger and yet the bound is means bound is less than 1 by 2n square, where that n is the input that we're taking.
No. So you are right that you will get a contradiction. But what I'm saying is you have to show that the continued fraction of s by r will not last long.
Okay.
And that will follow from Euclid's GCD algorithm, right? Because Euclid's GCD algorithm terminates in polynomial time in the representation of S and R. That means this small n which you have written in your thing is actually logarithmic of the input size of our factorization.
Yes. So I have given that result after proving this thing. So let me go to that. Then you can ask your doubt maybe.
No, my point is that, but you have to prove this, that you have to show that n is small, and then everything will be fine.
Okay. So so let me continue with this proof. I think the n thing is small. That I did not get much. Why? How to show that? So let me continue with this proof, and then again you can ask your doubt. So what we want to show is p by q is coming as a convergent when we expand x. So the basically the thing that we want to show is this thing. So there exists a lambda such that x equals to a0, a1 to an. After that we can replace it by lambda. So this is what we want to show. This is the mathematical proof. From a computational part I am coming later. So x equals to lambda pn. So what we are doing is we are applying the theorem that we proved last time. So x equals to lambda pn plus pn minus 1, lambda qn by qn minus 1, and we replace the x that we obtained over here. In this expression we replace this x, and after simplification we obtain lambda as this thing. This is our lambda that we obtain. So we know that qn pn minus 1, this thing we have proved is minus 1 whole to the power n. So we can assume that qn pn minus 1 minus pn qn minus 1 by delta, this is greater than 0. This is why this we can assume it. This is because if suppose if not, then these are having opposite sign. So we can do a trick over here. we can take the continued fraction a0 to an and expand it by a length of 1 so that the sign gets flipped, and we have this thing as positive. So now, as we have taken all a0 a1 to all the numbers as real numbers as positive, we can easily show that qn minus 1 is less than qn, and delta modulus is also less than 1. Means delta modulus is less than 1, we have already stated before, and qn minus 1 is less than qn is coming from those recursive expressions. Then we get that lambda is greater than 1. So we write lambda greater than 1, so we write lambda equals to b0 plus lambda bar, where lambda bar also lies between 0 and 1, and lambda bar will have a expansion of this kind, means b1 to bn. So what we after that, what we do is so we have actually obtained b0 to bm, this thing. So we can see that x contains this a1 to an, which was the which are not a1 to an, there should be a a0
A0
over
comma.
it. This thing is missing, I'll put it over there. So so a0 to an, this thing was our pn by qn. So this is coming inside x. So if we compute the continued fraction of x, we can get this p by q. Now completing the algorithm, I think this is the part where the confusion was occurring. So in Short's algorithm, we obtained a approximation of phi, a binary approximation phi of s by r, and we wanted to compute s by r. So what we wanted to do is s by r minus phi modulus this we wanted to put less than 1 by 2 n square. Then that is what we wanted to do. So so what we are doing is, in each step, observing each step, what we are doing, this convergence that we are calculating, sk by rk, this sk by rk is coming from this expression, which is greater than twice of sk minus 2, and rk, this is also twice of rk minus 2. Means in each step we are just doubling this thing each and every time we are going. So in each step we are keeping on doubling our result, and we can reach our desired h by r in order of log n steps. So so are you asking problem in this thing?
No. So you have given the proof here,
Hmm.
right? Which
Mhm.
so your third point
Hmm.
is exactly showing that
Hmm.
when you write S by R or P
Hmm.
by Q,
Hmm.
correct? In
Yes.
your in a continued fraction algorithm,
Mhm.
right? When you write its continued fraction expression,
Hmm.
the number of terms will be logarithm of P and Q.
Hmm. Yes.
That is
So
what you have shown in step number 3.
yes, that
I can,
means that is giving us the log means of order of log n,
so
means the
log
number
n,
of steps is order of log n.
log S or log R.
Hmm.
That means, so other way to say it would be that when you write the continued fraction or expression of P by Q,
Hmm.
it will stop in only log P, max of log P comma log Q steps,
Max of log p comma log q steps, and in
which is
the
bounded by log n.
and in our Short's algorithm, I think we were means we were having r as an order, so r was less than n, so
Correct.
we can do this thing.
Exactly. Exactly. And this was needed because if you don't, if the expansion of S by R is very, very long,
Hmm.
then your procedure, remember, just show the first point,
Yes.
stop whenever we get a close enough approximation. This will run for too long.
Yes. This approximation will run from
If
for
S
two.
by R had a very long continued fraction expansion.
Hmm.
And that we don't have the liberty to, right? We want the continued fraction expression to stop.
Hmm.
And the easy proof of the fact that S by R, the continued fraction expression is very small, is the fact that you are just doing Euclidean GCD algorithm, right?
Yes.
And we know that Euclidean GCD algorithm only takes log n steps
Hmm.
to finish.
So that
That means that S by R will also finish in log n steps.
Hmm.
The third proof we have given is the proof that Euclidean GCD stops in log n steps,
Hmm.
or max of log s log r steps.
So this is what our result was. So we are obtaining S by R in polylog time.
Correct.
So before ending, we have seen this one of the application of continuous fractions. There exists a lot more applications also that you can go and check. In classical algorithm for factoring also, we get a lot of continuous fraction applications. Like recently there was a result of Peter Schnorr who gave a better result for integer factoring. Over there was he also used continuous fraction as a tool in order to enhance the performance of his of the algorithm that he designed. So these are all the computational points that we discussed over here. As it turns out that continued fraction also has a lot of applications in pure mathematics. Like one of the application that is very important and interesting is solving the PL equation. So basically you solve a PL equation by applying tools from infinite continued fraction. So this you can this I could include over here. So this you can check, and the materials that I've given in, in, in the end. So actually in this book, in an introduction to theory of numbers, in this book itself it is given that how we are solving this PL equation by using continued fractions. So
Okay.
are there any more questions?
Thanks, Deeptaji. First thing is that I would ask both of you to send your presentations, please, so that I can put it on the website.
Yes, I'll do a little